good to be with you. The name Otabenga is a name that is little known today, but it is to our peril that this name has slipped into obscurity, because as the saying goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In the book, Otabenga, subtitled The Pygmy in the Zoo, author Harvey Bloom recounts the painful life of Otabenga, a young pygmy from the Congo who had been freed from African slave traders by an entrepreneur by the name of Samuel Werner, only to be brought to the United States and to be exploited as the main attraction in an anthropology exhibit in 1906, where he was exhibited in the Bronx Zoo's monkey house each day. Exhibits of dark-skinned humans as examples of so-called earlier stages of human evolution were all the rage in the early 20th century as Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection began to take hold. As a result, thousands of curious spectators flocked to see the little black man who stood only 4 foot 11 inches and weighed only 103 pounds. Not surprising, it was Christians, pastors in particular, who fought for Ota's freedom. A delegation of black churches petitioned the mayor of New York City for Ota's release from the zoo. He was eventually released to a pastor, James Gordon, who ran the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, affording Ota the chance to indulge his voracious appetite for learning. He was tutored in English and eventually took on employment. But through all of this, as you might imagine, Ota longed to return to his home in Africa. The outbreak of World War I, however, prevented him from doing so, plunging him into a deep, deep depression and resulting in his tragic suicide in 1916 at the age of only 32. Today, Otabenga's body is buried in an unmarked grave in Lynchburg, Virginia. The racially motivated exploitation of Otabenga is a disgraceful event in our nation's history. And today, 101 years later, almost every apparent form of bigotry is condemned in the strongest possible terms. And yet it seems that much of this expressed indignation is fabricated, since the very same thinking that once put Ota in the monkey house now puts little boys and girls in dumpsters. And this with little or no outcry from many in the church. We have gathered this evening to celebrate and to support the ministry of Compassion Pregnancy Center, a ministry that is on the front lines of the most pressing, most urgent, and most important battle in our nation today. And that is the battle for human equality. Or more to the point, it is the battle for life itself. This evening, I want to address the question that is at the heart of our national debate that has bitterly divided our nation over the subject of abortion. And this is a question that is almost never articulated, almost never verbalized, but it is without a question the question that is at the heart of this debate. And the question is simply this: who counts as one of us? You see, the debate over abortion today is not a debate over women's choice or reproductive freedom or women's rights. It is a debate over who counts. It is a debate over who will be valued and protected versus who will remain a candidate for the dumpster. And how we answer this question radically impacts the lives of every client that comes through the doors of this ministry. The mothers, their little ones, and the fathers as well. In fact, how we answer the question, who counts as one of us, impacts every person in this room this evening. Tonight, I want to help you see abortion for the evil that it is, and to convince you, should you need convincing, of your moral duty to speak up for and to sacrifice for mothers and their precious little ones. Abortion is a difficult and sensitive subject to address, and I recognize the particular difficulty of broaching this subject over a formal meal and on such a festive occasion. For many, and I'm sure many here this evening, or at least some here this evening, this is a deeply personal issue that invokes painful memories and feelings of guilt. This is the reason that this subject should be addressed or approached with sensitivity and grace. But this is not a reason to avoid the subject altogether, as so many Christians and churches are doing today. Love and compassion compel us to speak clearly and to speak boldly to the subject of abortion. Because if we, the body of Christ, remain silent, more babies will die, and more mothers and fathers will be burdened with a lifetime of guilt and regret. And I reject this notion that seems to have a stranglehold on the church today, that says we have to choose between speaking up for the unborn or sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, as if these are competing interests. Brothers and sisters, they are not. We have been called by God and empowered by His Spirit to speak up for those who have no voice, to condemn abortion as a great moral injustice, and yet to hold out the word of life, the gospel of Jesus Christ. We can do both. And in fact, if we fail in fulfilling either of those two obligations, we will have failed to fulfill Christ's love as He has called us to. If you have had an abortion, or you are responsible for an abortion decision, I'm happy to tell you that there is no sin so great, including the sin of abortion, but that God's grace is not greater still. Amen. And I love, that's right, amen. And I loved the hope-filled words of Isaiah 53, verse 5, a messianic prophecy that came to us through Isaiah 700 years before Christ came as an embryo, before He entered time and space as an embryo in the womb of a single mother. And these are the words. But He, Jesus, was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon Him, and by His wounds we are healed. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ in one Old Testament verse, and that is the spirit in which I address you this evening. I want to, as we consider this overarching question, who counts as one of us, I want to address three other questions. I'll pose them and then address these. These will serve as my outline this evening. And here they are up front. The first question is, what are the preborn? Before we can answer the moral question of abortion, we've got to back up and answer the predicate question, what are they? The second question I want to address is, what is it that makes us valuable as human beings in the first place? And the final question I want to give attention to is, what is our duty in this community? As followers of Jesus Christ, I'm assuming that most of you are. What is our moral duty to moms and the little ones they carry? So let's take a look at these three questions tonight. I want to start with that first one. What are the preborn? We are told by Planned Parenthood and their allies that abortion is a complicated issue. And apparently, in their thinking, if it's complicated, then that seems to justify abortion. Now, that's called a non sequitur. That doesn't follow. But the reality is abortion is not a complicated issue. In fact, it's a relatively simplistic issue. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood this evening. I'm not suggesting for a minute that it is psychologically or emotionally simplistic for a young woman or a young couple facing an unplanned pregnancy. That's not my point at all. But how does it follow that because abortion is psychologically or emotionally complex, that it is therefore morally complex? It really isn't. And we simplify the abortion debate by boiling it down to this question, what are the preborn? Greg Koukl, a Christian apologist, pro-life defender, said this. He said, if the unborn are not human, no justification for elective abortion is necessary. But if the unborn are human, no justification for elective abortion is adequate. And he's exactly right. This is the million-dollar question. What are they? The science of human embryology actually answers the question for us. From the moment that you were conceived in your mother's womb, you were a distinct, living, and whole human being. I'm just going to give you a little 7th grade science here. I hope I won't insult any of you, okay? But bear with me because I'm going somewhere with this. You are a distinct, living, and whole human being. Let me break those three words down. By distinct, I simply mean that as a single-cell zygote at that earliest stage of your development, you were a distinct or separate human being from your mother. You were in your mom. You were dependent upon your mom for blood, nutrients, oxygen, and the protection of her womb. But you were not your mom. You were you. At that earliest stage, you had a DNA that was different than your mother's. You had a race, a gender, and a blood type that were potentially also different than your mother's. You were not your mom. Not only were you a distinct individual at that earliest moment of your existence, but you were also a living human being. And I simply mean by that, alive and growing. That the things that define living organisms were present in you at that earliest stage of your development. You were metabolizing food for energy, growing through cellular reproduction, and responding to stimuli. Those are the things that define living organisms, and all of those were present in you at that earliest stage of your development. Not only were you distinct and living, but you were whole. Now, when I share this on high school campuses or even university campuses, people look at me cross-eyed like, what do you mean whole? You mean as a single-cell zygote or as a blastocyst, I was a whole human being? Yes, that's the science of human embryology. That genetically everything you needed to develop or to grow into the adult that you are today was present in you at that earliest stage of your development. So you were not part of your mother's body, you were in your mother's body. Living organisms, such as the embryo, have inner natures that work together as an integrated, coordinated whole to order their capacity and development. Now, we often hear, and perhaps you've said this before, but we often hear well-meaning, even Christian pro-life people will refer to the embryo at the earliest stage of development, or at least the earlier stages of development, as a fertilized egg. And I will let you in on a little math or a little science. I'm sorry, a little science. I'm not one to let anybody in on any math. But I will let you in on just a little bit of science here tonight. There is no such thing in the science of human embryology as a fertilized egg. Because once the ovum or the egg of a woman and the sperm of a man come together and fertilization takes place, the sperm and the egg have given their constituents over. They have died to themselves and given their constituents over to a new entity, namely a little girl or a little boy. And so we're no more justified in referring to little girls and boys as fertilized eggs as we would be to refer to them as a modified sperm. And that would be weird. Even in California, that would be weird. Now, I want you to know that what I've shared to this point, anyway, is the consensus of human embryologists. This is not debated on university campuses. In fact, Ward Kisher, University of Arizona, PhD, human embryologist, said this: every human embryologist in the world knows that the life of the new individual human being begins at fertilization. It is scientific fact. This is not being debated. In fact, many prominent pro-choice, so-called pro-choice philosophers like David Boonin, Peter Singer, Mary Elizabeth Williams, and many others are quick to acknowledge the humanity of the unborn child. Again, this is not debated. Okay, so that's the science question. Now, science can answer the question, well, what is a particular thing or a particular being? In other words, it can speak to the ontological nature and say, this is a human being, this is a giraffe, this is an elephant, whatever. But what science can't do is speak to the value of a human being. So we have to go to the philosophy question for that. And the philosophy question is real simple. The question, again, is simply this: what is it that makes us valuable as human beings in the first place? Are we valuable because of what we can do, or are we valuable simply because of the kind of thing that we are? There are only two ways of viewing and valuing human beings. There's no three ways, no four ways, two ways and two ways only. We are either valuable because of what we can do, or we are valuable simply because of the kind of thing that we are. I want to take just a few minutes here and do a quick summary for you, a quick flyover, if you will, of the pro-life view and then the competing view, the so-called pro-choice view. Let's start with our view. Our view, the pro-life view, which pro-life author Christopher Kazor refers to as the endowment view, and I think that's very apropos. This is the view that says that God has established our value. That you're not valuable because the crowd says you're valuable. You're not even valuable because you say you're valuable. You are valuable simply because you are created in God's image. The doctrine of the Imago Dei, that we are His image bearers, as we've already heard here this evening. That we are like Him. Jesus said it this way. He said, you are worth more than many sparrows. This is the principle of human exceptionalism, that there's something about us as human beings that's unique and special, that sets us apart from all the rest of creation. This is the view, the pro-life view, the endowment view, that is tolerant and inclusive. And I love saying that, because we are portrayed in the media, in Hollywood films, on university campuses as the haters who are waging a war on women. Right? Nothing could be further from the truth. It is our view that says every human being matters. Black, white, rich, poor, Jew, Gentile, born and unborn. That is a picture of inclusivity. It is our view, not theirs, that provided the philosophical and moral foundation for the Declaration of Independence, which says that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, most notably the right to, fill in the blank, life. This is the view, our view, the pro-life view, that says that living organisms maintain their identity throughout time and change. In other words, the embryo maintains his or her identity throughout time and change. You're the same being now as you were then. You've changed in a myriad of ways, but one thing has not changed about you, and that is your identity. And so if you're an intrinsically valuable human being today, you have always been and you always will be. Randy Alcorn, the author, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that name, said this. He said, "Something non-human doesn't become human by getting older and bigger. Whatever is human must be human from the beginning." This is the only true grounding, our view. The only true grounding for human equality. I'll say more about that. Let's now contrast our view with the competing view. And really what we're looking at here is two worldviews that are on a collision course with each other. The so-called pro-choice view, which Christopher Kazor, again, aptly refers to as the performance view. Now, I know those on the other side of this issue wouldn't appreciate that, but they'd have a hard time arguing it, because this is the view that says that only certain human beings matter, that only certain human beings should be accorded personhood status or respect, and only if they measure up to some so-called standard that the powerful have established for the weak. Things like sentience, self-awareness, heartbeat, brainwaves, wantedness, normalcy, and a whole host of other so-called standards that the other side arbitrarily picks out of the sky and decides this should be the standard that determines who lives and who dies. And if they don't measure up, then they're treated like vermin and disposed of as trash. This is the view, the so-called pro-choice view, that divorces humanness from personhood. You know, it used to be when people argued for abortion, excuse me, I have a drinking problem. I didn't share that with Sue when she hired me for tonight, but this is the view that it used to be when people defended abortion 30, 40 years ago, they would say, well, it's not a baby, it's a blob of tissue. It's not a baby, it's a product of conception. It's not a baby, it's a parasite. Nobody's arguing that way today. On university campuses, high school campuses, what you hear is, yes, it's a baby. Yes, it's alive. Yes, it's a little boy. It's a little girl. I'll grant you all of that. But it's not a person. And so this is a completely artificial distinction. Have you ever met a human being that wasn't a person? Do not point to your spouse. Look, this is smoke and mirrors. When you say, well, somebody's a human being, but they're not a person. When they say that to you, you should answer, what's the difference? Now, they're going to have an answer, but it's not a very solid answer. They're going to appeal to heartbeat, brainwaves, sentience, wantedness, and so on and so forth. Peter Singer, the radical ethicist at Princeton University, some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him. This is a radical defender not only of abortion, but a proponent of infanticide. Peter Singer believes that moms and dads ought to have a right to kill their infant children up to 1 month after birth, for any reason they see fit. He says that children that are born with severe fetal abnormalities should be put to death on the spot. Listen to what he said. Quote, "Human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons." Did you catch that? He says the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Now, I don't want to be unfair to the other side. Most so-called pro-choicers would not agree with that. But I will tell you that view is gaining traction on every campus I go to in the United States. This is not some kook off in a corner. This is a guy who is mainstream, whose book, Practical Ethics, is the gold standard on for ethics teaching in many, many secular universities today. The noted English journalist Malcolm Muggeridge, bemoaning the degenerate ideas that are shaping our universities and our culture at large today, stated this. He said, quote, "We have educated ourselves into imbecility." And he is exactly right. Clinton Wilcox, who serves on our staff at Life Training Institute, said this: "The question of who counts as a human being is a simple one to answer. It only becomes complex if you want to justify killing people." This view, the so-called pro-choice view, is intolerant. It is exclusivistic. It is elitist. Because the minute you divide the room or the womb based on subjectively chosen, arbitrarily chosen standards, again, to determine who should live and who should die, you have effectively destroyed any foundation for human equality. Every time the so-called pro-choice view or the performance view is chosen over the pro-life view or the endowment view, innocent people die. This is the worldview that brought us the ovens of Auschwitz. This is the view that put blacks in leg irons and on the back of the bus in America. Now, I'm not suggesting, I want to be clear here tonight, I'm not suggesting that pro-choice people support the Holocaust or support slavery or segregation. That's not my point. What I am saying is that the dumpsters of America's abortion clinics and the leg irons of slavery and the ovens of Auschwitz came out of the same pit of hell. The same corrosive, corrupted worldview. That cannot be argued. Their view put a man in the cage. Our view let him out. It was the Christian worldview that produced the outspoken Pastor James Gordon, who stood on the shoulders of the Hebrew midwives who centuries earlier disobeyed Pharaoh's order to murder all of the newborn Hebrew boys. This position is a position of bigotry. Make no mistake about it. It is a position of bigotry that is cloaked in the patriotic language of choice, fostering an animal-like survival of the fittest instinct where the big and powerful crush the weak and the vulnerable. Many today congratulate themselves for having moved beyond the moral ignorance of Ota Benga's captors who viewed him as a so-called lesser human being because of his size or because of his skin color. And yet many of these same people today defend the slaughter of innocent little boys and girls simply because of their size, or because of their location, or because of their gender, or because of a whole host of other reasons. Jerome Lejeune, the celebrated geneticist, said this, quote, "At Nuremberg, the horrible affirmation that a prisoner or a Jew is not a man, that one can thus exploit him, had been condemned. It was believed forever. And yet this same twisted notion reappears today, modernized, disinfected, miniaturized. An embryo is not a man or a person, thus, ... Thus we can dismember him in the name of choice." Men and women, we are repeating history. So how do we convince those who don't happen to hold to our worldview that the embryo you once were is no less valuable than the adult that you are today? Well, obviously we can't do justice to that question tonight, but let me briefly share a tool that will be helpful with you before I turn my attention to our final question this evening. I want to share an acronym with you. Some of you will be familiar with this. Others are hearing this for the first time, I'm sure, tonight, but this is an extremely helpful acronym. Remember the word SLED. SLED, S-L-E-D. I'm going to share with you, this was developed by Stephen Schwartz, a pro-life author, who points out that there are only 4 differences between the adult you are today and the embryo you once were. These are real differences, I'm acknowledging that, but they are not morally significant differences such that we can appeal to them to justify killing you in that earlier stage of your development, but not now. So here they are. And again, these are the differences that the other side appeals to justify abortion. The S in our acronym SLED stands for the word size. We hear from the other side all the time these arguments, well, it's so small, it doesn't look like us, we can't see it, so on and so forth. Therefore, we can justify aborting it. Well, here's the problem with that argument. Size doesn't equal value. Men are generally larger than women, except in my case. But that doesn't justify giving men greater rights, nor does it justify killing women. Now, you might hear that and say, well, you would really use that argument on a university campus? Yeah. And my opponent's going to say, oh, come on, Mike, that's ridiculous. That's not my point. My response, then what is your point? I'm not the one appealing to size to determine who should live and die. You are. It's interesting that they seem to want to apply it to those on the other side of the birth canal, but not on this side of the birth canal. How about the L? The L in the SLED acronym stands for level of development. Again, we hear these arguments all the time from the other side. Well, the baby's not viable, or the baby has a fetal abnormality, or it doesn't have a heartbeat yet. These are level of development arguments that we all hear. The problem with that is that 4-year-old girls are less developed than 14-year-old girls. For instance, 4-year-old girls don't have a fully functioning reproductive system. Does that justify killing 4-year-old girls? Well, of course not. Now, what's my opponent going to say? Oh, come on, Mike, that's not my point. And my response, then what is your point? If level of development or reaching some magical level of development is the thing that makes us valuable and therefore legally protectable, then my 17-year-old daughter, Catherine, doesn't count. My wife, Barb, who's here with me tonight, my wife and I have 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. Catherine is our youngest. Catherine is 17 years old. She was born with cerebral palsy. She is wheelchair-bound. Catherine has no practical use of her legs. She can stand up against a wall for a short period of time, but that's about it. She has virtually no practical use of her left hand. And her right hand, she has no fine motor skills. And at 17 years old, Catherine has the mentality level of about a 4-year-old. Now, if level of development is what makes people matter, Catherine's not as developed as many of us in this room, so I can justify killing her. Now, it's a repugnant thought to anybody with an operating conscience. Now, what's my opponent going to say? Oh, come on, Mike. That's not my point. And how are you going to respond? Then what is your point? You're the one, not me, appealing to level of development to determine who should live and who should die. You know, it's interesting. When Barb and I take Catherine out in public to a mall, a restaurant, wherever, perfect strangers are opening the door for this little girl. Why? Because God has placed in all of us a moral intuition that wells up. Even atheists, they wouldn't admit where it comes from, but they've got it. He has placed a moral intuition that wells up when we see need or handicap or disability. We naturally want to reach out. Perfect strangers offering to open the door for Catherine. On 2 different occasions, I've had people in parking lots offer to help me put the wheelchair in the van because they see I'm built like a 5th grade girl. I'm like, well, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the help. Here, I'll hold your cane for you. No, I'm teasing. I really am teasing. But here's the point. Isn't this ironic that on this side of the birth canal, Catherine gets extra love? And on the other side of the birth canal, in many wombs in America, we put a crosshairs on her chest and snuff her out in the name of choice for the same reason we open doors for her. We have lost our minds as a culture. She's the same kid. The same person. Her identity didn't change. Your nature could never change. All kinds of things about you can change, but your nature remains the same. You're the same person now as you were then. How about the E in our SLED acronym? The E stands for environment or location. You were in the womb, and now you're out of the womb. So what? What's that got to do with anything? How could an 8-inch journey down the birth canal magically transform somebody from a mere human to a person? I mean, it's just a change of address, okay? For the baby, moms who've delivered babies, I know it's more for you. But for the baby, it's just a change of location. How about the D? The D in our SLED acronym stands for degree of dependency. Again, we hear these arguments from the other side. Again, viability would also fall into this category and several others. You know, the baby's dependent upon the mom and so on and so forth, as if that justifies aborting them. Why should dependency render a human being disposable? If it does, what do we do with conjoined twins who are dependent upon each other for absolutely everything? If I were to take a show of hands, I won't do this, but if I were to take a show of hands and ask, how many of you tonight are dependent upon somebody else, something else, medicine, government assistance, a spouse who's the breadwinner? Probably most of the hands in this room would go up. Now, when you say that to your university professor or that brother-in-law of yours who's had raw bat meat for breakfast, he's going to say to you, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not my point. And you're going to respond, what is your point? So if we can demonstrate through the science of human embryology that from the moment of conception you have a distinct living and whole human being, and if we can demonstrate through philosophy that there's no moral difference between the adult you are today and the embryo you once were, then that brings us to an obvious question, our final question tonight. We've looked at the science question, the philosophy question, and now the moral question. And it is simply this: what is our duty? Or more specifically, what is your duty as Christians to young mothers and to their little ones in this community? As we consider your part in the ministry of the Compassion Pregnancy Center, I want to offer a final challenge to you. Each generation has the astonishing ability to be repulsed by the moral crimes of those who came before them, while in many cases repeating many of those same offenses. The former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, writing of the brutality that was visited upon slaves by their slave owners 150 years ago, said that slaveholders abused, raped, and even murdered their slaves, quote, with almost as much impunity as upon the deck of a pirate ship. And he's right. He was right. There was no secret in 1860 about what was happening on plantations. In fact, when slaves would escape, their owners, their slaveholders, would run ads in the newspaper brazenly offering rewards for the return of their slave and describing their slave as last having been seen with leg irons or with a chain around its neck or with scars on his or her back. But unlike the brutal treatment of slaves, the brutal treatment of the unborn by abortion is well hidden from the majority of Americans. Abortion has been sanitized. And abortion clinics have gotten really good at cleaning up after themselves. And as a result, most people have never seen what abortion does to an unborn child. And my guess is that there are many here, even this evening, who have never really seen abortion in all of its ugliness. I have. And in fact, in 1991, when I was pastoring in Fort Wayne, Indiana at the time, my wife and I held abortion in our hands. In 1991, my wife Barb and I held in our hands on a cloth diaper a little black baby girl who had been aborted somewhere around 5-6 months of gestation by a saline solution abortion, which means that her body was still perfectly intact. She had been burned from her mother's womb and discarded in an abortion clinic here in the Detroit area. And we held that lifeless little body in our hands, and she was beautiful, perfectly formed. But that black, beautiful black skin had been horribly discolored by that saline solution that burned her both internally and externally. And I hear all of the rhetoric from the other side on university campuses. My body, my choice. Don't like abortion, don't have one. Every child a wanted child. I hear all of the sloganeering. But when you hold in your hands the product of choice, a dead, lifeless little girl, all of a sudden, this isn't abstract anymore. And all of a sudden, all of the cliches and all of the sloganeering and all of the bumper stickers disintegrate under the weight of that lifeless child. And I would never do this for so many reasons. But I can't tell you how often I've been on university campuses and wished I could take that little girl and hold her out and say, you tell me that this little one didn't deserve to live. You tell me that this is only a human being and not a person. Abortion is the intentional and unjust killing of innocent human beings in the most barbaric manner imaginable. Abortion dismembers, decapitates, disembowels, and burns little girls and boys from their mother's wombs. The butchered and burned bodies of little boys and girls is the irrefutable evidence that the real extremists and those who are waging the war on women are not pro-lifers, but rather those who deny children their most fundamental right, the right to be born. If abortion is not evil, one is left wondering, is anything evil? The columnist George Will said this, quote, there is nothing so vulgar left in the human experience for which we cannot fly in some professor from somewhere to justify it. He said that a long time ago. We don't have to fly these professors in. They're on every campus in our land. Responding to that quote, Ravi Zacharias, a great defender of the unborn, great Christian apologist, said this. He said, quote, the lesson is obvious. To be an intellectual is a great privilege, but to be an intellectual without God is dangerous. He's right. Elective abortion is a moral monstrosity that dwarfs every other moral and social injustice. We look back now with greater moral clarity at slavery and at segregation, and we are embarrassed by it, and rightly so. It is a pockmark on the pages of our nation's history. We scorn the memory of those whose apathy and whose love for personal comfort constricted their circle of moral responsibility so tightly as to exclude their black brothers and sisters. But what about us? What about us in 2017? Where is the outrage from the church? Why have the overwhelming majority of Catholic and Protestant pulpits gone silent when it comes to the subject of abortion? It is easy, comfortably removed by 150 years from slavery or 60 plus years from segregation, to romanticize how we might have responded to the cruel oppression of our black brothers and sisters had we lived at that time. And I've wondered myself, I'm 54 years old, and I've wondered, had I been old enough to do so, would I have marched with my black brothers and sisters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965? And the honest answer is, I don't know. I would like to think that I would have, but I really don't know. Here's what I do know. If we will not speak up for and sacrifice for the little ones who are in the crosshairs of choice in the United States today in 2017, when there is virtually no cost for doing so, and it may not always be that way, but it is that way now. If we will not speak up now when there is virtually no cost for doing so, then we can know with absolute certainty we would not have stood with our black brothers and sisters, because gentlemen, ladies, this is our Goliath. This is the Goliath that is taunting the church in America today. Elective abortion is not just another issue. It is the defining moral issue of our time. Imagine if we were not talking about 2,700 unborn children dying every day by legalized abortion. Suppose instead we were talking about 2,700 toddlers being killed by abortion every day. Would any of us say, well, that's just one of many issues? Or would we say, no, this is our Goliath? I love the theme of tonight's banquet, standing in the gap. Ezekiel 22. And I'll ask you tonight, where are the Elijahs? Where are the Daniels? The Esthers? In his autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom, Frederick Douglass wrote of, quote, the infernal character of slavery. And he said, quote, the slaveholder as well as the slave is the victim of the slave system. A man's character greatly takes its hue and shape from the form and color of things about him. Abortion is like that. It has an infernal character about it that is plundering our nation's conscience, leaving us cold and indifferent toward the least of these. And the hue and shape, to borrow the words of Frederick Douglass, of our character is being taken from the form and color of our response or lack thereof to abortion. A failure to respond to abortion is amputating our soul and disfiguring the spirit of the church in America. It is damaging our gospel witness. I am grateful for pastors and priests who champion the cause of the preborn. Some here this evening, I've met a few of you. Some of my closest friends are pastors. I was a pastor. I hope that gives me a license to say what I'm going to say. The reality is, however, is that most shepherds have abandoned their moral duty and have become tongue-tied when it comes to speaking up for moms and their little ones whose lives hang in the balance. And when shepherds refuse to speak up for the preborn, they do not, as my boss, Scott Klusendorf, says, they do not spare women who've had abortions hurt, they spare them healing. And I'll add this. When shepherds go silent in the pulpit, they communicate one of two messages, both regrettable. Either abortion's not so bad, or the gospel's not so good. Either abortion's not so bad. If it were, my pastor would certainly speak out against it. He speaks out against other sins, other evils. Or the gospel's not so good. In other words, if I've had an abortion in my congregation, my pastor never speaks about it, I must be the worst person in this flock. My sin must be so evil, so bad, that the blood of Christ is not sufficient to atone for it because my pastor won't speak to it. These are horrible, horrible messages for the body of Christ to communicate. We can and we must do better. Jesus Christ provides freedom from the guilt and the power of sin. John 8:36, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Philippians chapter 1 speaks of the sanctifying work that God begins in us, that God's Spirit begins in us the moment we come to faith in Christ and we receive forgiveness for our sins, whatever those sins are. In other words, God doesn't just promise to forgive you through Christ if you've had an abortion. He promises to put you back together emotionally. This is the message that Sue and her team at the Compassion Pregnancy Center are bringing to young moms who feel cornered by life circumstances every day in this community. Being bound to Jesus Christ and the Scriptures does not provide us refuge from the conflict over abortion. It demands our engagement. Love compels us to enter the conflict and to sacrifice on behalf of those who have no voice. But if our hearts are cold and unresponsive toward children at their most vulnerable stage of development, if we can close off our hearts to children, then we have closed off our hearts to God Himself. Now, those aren't my words. Those are Christ's words. Because He said, I tell you that what you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. Responding to abortion is a gospel issue. It is a loving your neighbor as yourself issue that often presents us and frequently presents Sue and her team with a gospel opportunity to share the most pressing need that any of us have, and that is the need for forgiveness that comes only through Jesus Christ. Why do we love moms and their little ones? Because He first loved us. Amen? This, again, is the message that Sue and her team bring every day to moms who are scared and alone. Moms like Virginia. I mean, you've heard this tonight. And this evening, you have the opportunity to land on the right side of history with respect to abortion. Sue and her team are asking you to stand with them as they hold out the word of life in this community. Now, you've heard about their work. Many of you have known about it for years. Others maybe are hearing about it for the first time tonight. But you have seen their work this evening. This ministry is a good investment. This ministry is a smart investment. I had the opportunity, my wife and I, Barb and I, had the opportunity today to tour the center. You walk in, warm faces, gentle-spirited people. I'm a father of 4 daughters, and I've imagined, what would it be like for one of my daughters to walk into the Compassion Pregnancy Center? And I know they would be loved. And I know they would receive the gospel, and I know they'd receive the tangible help that they need. They have is it called a baby boutique? Is that what you call that room? Unbelievable. You go in this thing, I mean, they've got clothes. It's all beautifully sorted. This is nice clothing. They've got this whole rack of blankets that have been handmade by women in this community. Unbelievable place. And they've got big plans, big needs, as you've heard tonight from Sue's report that Jim read for us. The plan is to take that building, which is already a nice building, but to take it and make it even better. They've got some major renovation needs in that building. And tonight, about 40%, they're hoping that about 40% of their annual budget is going to be raised here tonight by you, so that they can do that work and so that they can carry on the work that God has called them to. They are the real friends of women. They are the real friends of women. Parenting classes, post-abortion classes, ultrasound. I mean, what a window to the womb. I mean, this is incredible what they're doing. Now, I'm not asking you tonight to get behind them. I'm asking you tonight to come alongside of them, to lock arms with them, to dig deep in your pockets, to do more than you thought you were going to do when you got in the car to come here this evening. I'm asking you tonight to lift a burden from them, from this staff, so that they can be about the business that God has called them to. They are not professional fundraisers. They are counselors. They are lovers of moms and babies. And we can lift a burden from them tonight. I am asking you tonight to put your treasure where your heart is. And maybe you've come to the conclusion that your heart really isn't with moms and babies. No problem. We can fix that right here and now. I'm asking you to put your treasure there anyway and watch your heart follow along. Because Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.